Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our third session. There'll probably be some people trickling in. And so tonight is a special evening as we are going to focus in on an individual whose name you have heard, C.S. Lewis. And it's going to be a wonderful time that we have together. I'll introduce our guest here in just a moment, but we are going to begin as we started last week, because I'd forgotten the first week to start with a hymn. So we are going to sing a hymn again this evening. And this evening we are going to sing, "Be Thou My Vision." So Janine, thankfully, is here to lead us in "Be Thou My Vision." So sing it out. Is that the right? Thou my soul. Wait, let's start that one again, okay? Be thou my battle shield, sword for my fight. Be thou my dignity, thou my delight. Thou my soul shelter, and thou my high tower. Raise thou me heavenward, O power of my power. Riches I heed not, or man's empty praise. Thou my inheritance, now and always. Thou art thine only first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. Thank you, Janine. Well, let's pray. Lord, that's the heart of our prayer this evening, that you would be our vision. Even though our immediate subject tonight is the thinking, the writings, and the leadership of C.S. Lewis's influence in the lives of so many Christians, we really ask that even through the lens of our conversation, our thoughts tonight, that you would be our vision. Because all of the things that we are studying and thinking about, Lord, we want those to be a lens through which we behold you and your beauty and your goodness as you have worked through the annals of time to accomplish your purposes, which admittingly to us are a bit mysterious. But we thank you for your sovereignty, for your glory, for your goodness, and that all of history is in your loving, good, caring hands. We thank you that you are with us tonight in the presence of your Holy Spirit. We ask that you would guide our teacher tonight and our own thoughts, that they would be tuned to you, and that through these thoughts we would be more available, our minds would be more available to be transformed into the image of your Son, Jesus Christ. So thank you for this evening, for our time together, and for each other. And we pray these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, it was so appropriate for us to sing an Irish hymn tonight because C.S. Lewis, contrary to what some people think, was not English. He was actually Irish, and he was very clear about saying that to people who asked, even though he had developed quite a fine English accent, of course, in his training. But I don't want to step on the grounds of our teacher tonight. I am really pleased to welcome and introduce to you Dr. Mark Nelson. Dr. Nelson is a professor of philosophy at Westmont, and he has a PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame, but he lived and taught at the University of Leeds in England for many years, so he is very familiar with England, in particular because his wife is English. So anyway, it's just such a joy to have him. He is a longtime student of all things Lewis and teaches in the Augustinian Scholars Program up at Westmont, which is an honors program. And he teaches the unit, the class on C.S. Lewis. So it's a great joy to have him here this evening. So please welcome Dr. Mark Nelson.
Absolute favorite authors. I don't agree with him about everything. Hooray! But in my experience, even when I disagree with him, he just opens up fresh ways of thinking for me as a Christian, and has done for many years. As Eric also mentioned, I'm married to an English woman, so I am a Britophile, and I love all things British. And Lewis was, of course, a great British writer and thinker. He's most famous, of course, for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the rest of the Chronicles of Narnia. But he also wrote poetry, literary criticism, philosophy, theology, apologetics. I don't want to expose anybody here, but who here has read at least one of the Narnia books? Okay, all right, good, good. That's most of you. As some of you will know, Westmont actually owns C.S. Lewis's wardrobe. The one that was supposedly the inspiration for the wardrobe in the... I have unusually small ears. So let's try that again. So Westmont owns C.S. Lewis's wardrobe. Now, interestingly enough, my undergraduate alma mater, Wheaton College in Illinois, also owns a wardrobe from C.S. Lewis's childhood home. And as furniture goes, the Wheaton wardrobe is older and more impressive looking. But it doesn't really match the description of the wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Westmont's does. So I think Westmont's claim to have the wardrobe has more merit than Wheaton's. Anyway, most of you probably already know quite a lot about Lewis, but in case you don't, or in case you want a refresher, let me share some information about him. And this is 8 or 9 things about C.S. Lewis that you may not have known. And I will begin with a timeline. So, Lewis was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, to a well-to-do middle-class family. 1898, this is near the end of Queen Victoria's reign and before the Irish War for Independence and the creation of the Republic of Ireland in 1922. You can see there, next big event I've got on the timeline, 1908, Lewis's mother, Flora, dies. She died of cancer when he was only 9 years old. This was emotionally devastating to him and was one of the things that led him to abandon the Christian faith of his childhood. His widower father, named Albert, was also devastated and crushed by grief, and he had no idea about how to raise 2 sons as a single parent. So he did what a lot of well-to-do families did at that point, and he shipped C.S. Lewis and his brother, whose nickname was Warnie. He shipped Jack and Warnie off to various boarding schools in Ireland and England. Some of these were good, some of them were terrible. In 1908, he's sent to the Wynyard School in Watford, Hertfordshire. This one was disastrous, according to Lewis. And he reports that while they were there, it became clear the schoolmaster had actually started to become insane. They learned almost nothing, and there were regular beatings and all kinds of erratic behavior. He begged his father by letter to let him come home, which the father eventually did. The father pulled the boys out. The school was shut down almost immediately because the authorities had got wind of the fact that the headmaster had become unhinged. So in 1910, he's sent to Campbell College in Belfast, Northern Ireland. This was a local boarding school near his house, and he liked it a lot. But during that time, he came down with a serious respiratory infection, so his father had to pull him out of school again. And Lewis liked it there. He liked it fine. But by the time he had recovered, the father had decided to send him to school in England again. So he packed him and his brother off to boarding school. Well, his brother was already there. So 1911, Lewis begins at Cherbourg School in Great Malvern. This is in the southwest of England, Worcestershire. And it is in the same town as Malvern College, which is one of the great public schools in the UK. So he begins his study at Cherbourg, and that was a kind of prep school, the so-called, because they're meant to prepare boys to attend one of the elite public schools. So 1913, he starts at Malvern College, which is one of the elite public schools like Eton and Harrow and Shrewsbury and Winchester and Rugby. So it's up there in that elite echelon. Interesting fun fact, my wife's mother went to Malvern Women's College. Actually, not very many years after Lewis would have been there. Another significant thing is 1913, by Lewis's reckoning, he had abandoned his Christian faith. A number of factors, and he recounts these in his book, Surprised by Joy. But one of them was the sort of lingering grief and incomprehension he had over the death of his mother. 1914, he and his father conclude that he needs private tuition if he is going to make it into Oxford. So they go to the home of William Kirkpatrick. In Surprised by Joy, he is described as the Great Knock. Interestingly, Kirkpatrick had previously taught at Campbell College and been one of the leaders there. He had retired and was only taking individual students at this point. Lewis's father had studied under the Great Knock earlier. Anyway, according to Lewis, Kirkpatrick was the one person more than any other who taught him to think and to think critically. If you haven't read his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, you see, I mean, it's one of my favorite books. I've read it so many times, it's falling apart. But if you haven't read it, I strongly urge you to do that. In fact, I have a suggestion. Get a copy, bring it with you, read it on the plane. What a great idea. So, there's a wonderful account of the day he meets Kirkpatrick, and he's trying to make small talk, and he says some inane thing for what he has no real reason to say. He's just making small talk. Kirkpatrick rounds on him and says something on the order of, "Why did you say that? Did you have any reason for saying that?" And Lewis thinks, no. Then you had no right to say it. You had no right to any opinion on the matter at all. And the relationship kept going in that vein for the next 2 years. But Lewis learned to spar back. He learned the ropes argumentatively, logically, rationally, all while learning Latin and Greek and German and French to a very high standard. So, let's see how we're doing here. 1917, he begins his study in Oxford University. He is admitted to the university. He writes a good enough essay to get a scholarship. But almost immediately, he joins the army and fights in the First World War. He was at University College very briefly. It's one of the oldest and wealthiest colleges. But as I say, he and a bunch of his peers at the time knew they weren't going to be staying long. Almost immediately, they drop out, join the army. 1918, he is wounded in action and he convalesces. 1919, he returns to University College. Yes, that's right. In 1922, he earns a first in greats in Oxford. You'll see that term greats. That was the name of one of their degrees. I mean, the Latin name was Literarii Humanis. It's really a combination of classics, history, and philosophy, emphasizing Latin and Greek. 1923, he takes a first in English language and literature. I should comment on the first. In British degrees, you don't get a GPA, you don't get summa cum laude or magna cum laude or cum laude. Your degree is classified on a numerical scale. First, upper second, lower second, third. If you don't even get a third, you can get what's called an ordinary degree. But that means that you can't put the initials HONS for honors. Or you can fail. First class, it's a remarkable achievement. He got it in 2 subjects. He wanted to hang around, oops, sorry, I've gone way ahead. There we are. He wanted to hang around Oxford, so he, for 1 year, substitutes for a philosophy teacher, E.F. Carrot, who had gone to visit, to give visiting lectures at the University of Michigan. So Lewis takes over as a philosophy tutor, and he spends that year learning philosophy in depth. 1925, he is elected a fellow of Magdalen College. And let me call your attention to the pronunciation there. It looks like it should be Magdalene or Magdalena, but they don't say it that way. And if you ask in Oxford, can I go see Magdalen College? They, don't know, can't help you. They pronounce it Magdalen, just like the word for sentimental. 1931, he returns to Christian faith. 1941-42, and all this while he's working as a fellow of Magdalen College. He's giving lectures. He is leading tutorials. He's doing some writing, but he was not a national figure at this point. He was not nationally well known at all until 1941-42. He is invited by the BBC to give some inspirational wartime lectures. Britain is already at war. They've already had the Blitz. Morale is pretty poor. The people in the government and people in the BBC were looking around Britain for, well, really someone who could give lectures that the country would rally around, that it would help build morale and community, remind them of their common Christian heritage, and remind them of their moral compass. They selected Lewis. The talks were very well received overall, not universally. He does recount that he got some fairly harsh responses, but that for the most part, people really liked and appreciated them. And these talks were later published as separate booklets, and then edited and repackaged as the book Mere Christianity. And I'm sure some of you have read Mere Christianity. So those were written in 41, 42. As I say, the talks were a big hit, and the government was grateful to him, so much so that later in life, he was offered a CBE. A CBE, he was offered this by Winston Churchill, but he declined it. The CBE, short for Commander of the British Empire, that's a chivalric order established to recognize service to the empire, and Lewis was nominated to appear on the last honors list of King George VI in December 1951. It was a coveted honor. It's just below a knighthood. And it was offered to him for his public service for writing and broadcasting during the war. Interestingly, this has only come out recently after Lewis's personal correspondence became available to the public. And so we actually have seen his letter. He said, quote, "I feel greatly obliged to the Prime Minister, and so far as my personal feelings are concerned, this honor would be highly agreeable." However, he added that many people said or believed that Christianity is basically, quote, "covert anti-leftist propaganda, and my appearance in the honors list would of course strengthen their hands. It is therefore better that I should not appear there." So do you see what he's saying? He's saying, I would love to get this, but I think that there are people who would interpret this in the wrong way. There are people who would say, you got a reward just because you were sending the political message the government wanted you to send. And he doesn't want his Christian witness to be connected with that. So with regret, he actually declines the award. 1955, he is made a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature in Cambridge. I'll talk more about this later. 1956, he marries Joy Davidman. 1957, he marries Joy Davidman. 1960, Joy Davidman dies. You will notice that the timeline shows him marrying Joy Davidman in 1956 and 1957. That's not a typo. Do any of you know what happened there? Okay, this is very interesting, and he recounts the story to a certain extent in A Grief Observed. And there's also a nice account of it in the McGrath biography. Joy Davidman was an American poet, a rather successful poet and writer, lived in New York. She was married, had 2 small sons. She was married to an abusive alcoholic husband, and so she fled. She had lots of contacts in England, and she was a teacher of English literature herself. So she took the boys and went to England. There was some question about her eligibility to stay there, about her visa, and it became clear she was due to be deported because she had overstayed her visa. Lewis had got to know her very casually, was not even very, I mean, he was taken with her. He thought she was a remarkable woman, and he enjoyed her company, but really as an act of friendship, he proposed a chaste green card marriage. He was going to marry her in form only, just so she could stay, and wouldn't have to go back to her abusive husband, from whom she was now divorced. But something unusual happened, that very quickly Lewis and she fell in love. And once they had fallen in love, he thought it's not enough to have a city hall public registry marriage. He wanted a proper church wedding. And so he had a proper church wedding to Joy Davidman in 1957. They had several happy years together. In the middle of this, she gets, I think it's bone cancer. It was some kind of cancer. A remarkable thing happens. They pray over her and administer holy water. And I think they have her blessed with oil. And she makes complete remission. He thought that she was going to die immediately, but she has a remission, and they have 2 or 3 more years together. She's well enough that they can do things like travel. They live together at his house, the Kilns. He never really adopts her boys legally, I think, but he effectively becomes their stepfather. But she dies in 1960, and if you want to know more about this, again, there's an account, a really moving account in his book, A Grief Observed. Lewis died at home in 1963. I neglected to show you my pictures of Joy Davidman. That's her as a young woman. This is Lewis and Davidman together. I really like that photo because here's Lewis, the curmudgeonly bachelor. He's been a curmudgeonly bachelor all of his life until 1956, looking, I think, with real tender affection. So, you'll see 1963, he dies at home in the Kilns, Oxford. I think I've got a picture of this, of his home. I gather you will be seeing. And touring. Wonderful. Oh, lucky. Now, he died of enlarged prostate 1 week shy of his 65th birthday. That was November 22, 1963. Do any of you happen to remember what else happened on that date? Correct. JFK assassination. Interestingly also, it was the death of Aldous Huxley. JFK, Huxley, C.S. Lewis all die on the same day. Lewis was by this time a world-famous author, but the story of his death was almost completely eclipsed by the Kennedy assassination. We'll get to that in just a moment. Well, actually, no, since we're up. Nope. There we are. Here's a timeline of some of his major books. So, 1933, his book Pilgrim's Regress. This was his first book of an apologetic nature after his conversion to Christianity. He had published some poetry before. Interestingly, and people like McGrath point this out, Lewis initially thought that his big contribution to literature was going to be his poetry. He wanted to be a poet. He had ambitions to be a great poet of the English language. Now, and he gets a little recognition. Some of his poems are published, slim volume. They aren't particularly well received. And whereas I do like just about everything of Lewis's that I have read, my students say that I'm a pathetic fanboy of Lewis. I'm not crazy about his poetry. I don't think it's as good as his other prose stuff or his literary criticism or his philosophy or his apologetics or his fiction. But, you may, your taste may differ. Now, but his first philosophy book of any note was Pilgrim's Regress, 1933. And you can see The Allegory of Love. That was his first major work of literary interpretation. And this put him on the map in Oxford. It's, it has to do with the interpretation of medieval and Renaissance literature. You see the Out of the Silent Planet, that's the first volume of his space trilogy, fiction, light fiction. Have any of you read the space trilogy, any of those books? Okay. So that's the first one, 1938. 1940, Problem of Pain, one of his most important apologetic books. 42, Screwtape Letters. Preface to Paradise Lost, that's more literary criticism. 43, Perelandra, that's the second in the space trilogy. Abolition of Man, Christian Behavior. 1944, Beyond Personality. 1945, The Great Divorce, That Hideous Strength. So it was Christian Behavior and Beyond Personality that were published together as Mere Christianity. 45, as I say, The Great Divorce. Screwtape Letters and Great Divorce are, to my mind, my favorite of his. It's hard to even know what to call these. He calls them imaginative supposals, but I think they're really works of spiritual theology and moral psychology. I happen to have, is there anybody here who hasn't read Screwtape Letters? Okay. I have an extra copy I found on my shelf. Here you go.
Wow, well, I'll pass it on to whoever else has it.
There you go. Again, easy to read. You can read it on the plane. No problem. Now, 1950, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's the first of the Narnia books. 51, Prince Caspian. 52, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. 53, Silver Chair. 54, Horse and His Boy. 55, Magician's Nephew. 55 is The Surprise by Joy. As I say, I don't have a second copy. I just have this one battered one. But I really do. This is one of my favorite books in the English language. I mean, I just think it's a magnificent book. If you haven't read it, I strongly urge you to do it. It's just so interesting and revealing and spiritually and psychologically perceptive. And it really accounts for his life, his loss of faith, and his education, and then how he gradually came back to Christian faith. And there's also lots of interesting stuff about what it was like to study at Oxford between the wars, what it was like to be a lecturer in literature in Oxford between the wars. 1956, Last Battle, that's the last of the Narnia books. 1956, also, Till We Have Faces. This is a wonderful book. It's a piece of fiction. And Lewis tells us someplace that, or he hints at, that's actually his favorite thing that he wrote. That's the book of his own that he liked the best. Interestingly, it's also one of his less well-read ones. I mean, people don't know about it, and it's not in the Space Trilogy, it's not a Narnia book, it's not an apologetic book, so it sort of falls between the stools. But it's really interesting, and, if he thought it was his best book, maybe you should give it a look. 1960, The Four Loves, and 1961, A Grief Observed. And as I say, that's an account of, his devastation and his coming to terms with the loss of his wife. Now, I should pause. Any questions about what I've said so far? Yeah?
I didn't see in his book that he wrote on miracles.
Beg your pardon?
Miracles?
I don't know the timeline or when that. Actually, I can find out here. I'm just having to cheat and go into. Looks like 1947. That's also a wonderful book of apologetics. I think it's really profound. Other comments or questions? Yeah, man in the back.
Is it known what caused him to return to faith? Or what was the moment?
It's actually a complex story, and I will touch on that a little bit in a moment. But that's really the central third of this book is all about that. There were a number of different stages along the way. And so, for example, and McGrath in the biography is very helpful. I'm jumping ahead here. I'm speaking out of order. I'm off script. If you're looking for a way to summarize Lewis's mindset, I think a good, quick characterization is he is a romantic rationalist, or a rationalist romantic, meaning he wants both the head and the heart. He wants an approach to Christian faith that makes sense of the inner man or the inner woman, their emotions, their feelings, what it feels like to be a human being, what it feels like to be a human being who's lost a parent or lost a wife or has been wounded in the war. Thanks to Kirkpatrick, the great knock, he doesn't feel ever entitled to hold any opinion that he doesn't have sufficient rational reason for. So his whole intellectual career is an attempt to bring these together, to bring the head and the heart together. And that's very much true in his return to faith. There were a number of ideas of modernity and scientism that he felt made Christian faith untenable. Intellectually, the rationalist in him was not content until he had exposed what he thought was the errors of that kind of scientism. And he thought that the so-called scientific and materialistic basis for atheism, he felt that philosophically it didn't hold water. So that was a big part of it. Then he returns to something like generic theism. That is to say, on philosophical grounds, he believes that a God exists, and this is a powerful, omniscient, holy being who is the author of the moral law and to whom we have many obligations. But he's not a Christian. Here I'm jumping ahead again off script. Why did he become a Christian? Part of it is that, well, it's not that he has philosophical or scientific reasons for believing that Jesus rose from the dead, but rather he comes to believe that it is an emotionally compelling and satisfying myth. Now, by myth, he means a set of symbols and stories that are powerful and ancient and deep and that express the cosmic order. So that's his definition. But he also thinks that by definition a myth can't be true. Christianity is a beautiful myth, and it appeals to the heart of him, the emotional side. Interestingly, and here's where, again, I'm talking out of order here, one of his best friends was J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I remember coming to love Lewis. I'd actually read Tolkien first, loved Tolkien, and I was just amazed to think, wow, these guys were in Oxford together. That's pretty remarkable. And then it was amazing when I heard they actually knew each other. That I learned they were actually really good friends. In fact, I knew Lewis as a Christian. Then I learned Tolkien was a Christian. He was a very devout Roman Catholic, very committed. And then I learned, and again, this is quite remarkable, Tolkien is one of the people who brought C.S. Lewis to Christian faith, because Tolkien also was a specialist in what is sometimes called modern mythology, the Arthurian legends, Spencer, things like this. Lewis's big complaint was Christianity is a beautiful myth, but myths are by definition false. Tolkien persuaded him that that didn't have to be true. I mean, a myth is first and foremost, I say, it's this set of symbols and stories that are old and ancient, are very deep, they're almost primeval things, and they express the cosmic order. And Tolkien says, they spend many nights debating this, going on long walks in the middle of the night. Tolkien finally persuades him that myths can be true. That there can be some sets of symbols and stories that are ancient and primeval and deep that express the cosmic order. And it just so happens that some of these can be true. And he thinks the Christian story, the story of God's creation, God's incarnation in Jesus, the crucifixion and death and resurrection, that this is a true myth. That is, it's a myth that's not by definition false. It's a powerful story, it's a powerful symbol, but it is also literally true. Now, you don't have to buy this. I mean, this is a complex philosophical thesis, and there's no need for you to accept it. But the man in the back asks, how did he come to faith? Well, this is how he did. And he credits Tolkien with helping him to see Christianity didn't have to be false just because it was a myth in the technical sense. Now, so here's how are we doing on time, Chris? Where's Chris? Oh, Eric, I mean.
We're fine. We got 45 minutes.
Okay, I probably won't take all that time. So, having said all that, let me just list some things that I think are interesting about Lewis, 8 or 9 things that are not always sufficiently recognized or appreciated. One of them, Eric already alluded to. Lewis was not English. He was Irish. He was born in Ireland. He thought of himself as an Irishman his whole life. And I can tell you, having been in both Scotland and Ireland, it's a big mistake to forget where you are or just to treat them like they're the same place. Imagine going to Texas and saying, boy, it sure is great here in Oklahoma. Think about what kind of reaction you would get. It's even worse if you were to say, in Ireland, I love it here in England. They're different nations, they're different people, they have different intersecting histories, and lots of conflict. Lewis says in Surprised by Joy, and here I'm quoting, "No Englishman will be able to understand my first impressions of England." He had landed at Liverpool when his father sent him to boarding school. He says, "The strange English accents with which I was surrounded seemed like the voices of demons." But what was worse was the English landscape. He saw it was compared to the hills and the greenery of Northern Ireland near his house, the flat landscape, industrial landscape between Liverpool and his school was just horrible. I mean, it would just be like, well, I don't want to make any comparisons that might step on toes. He says, "I have made up the quarrel since, but at that moment I conceived a hatred for England which took many years to heal." So this is important to know. One thing, not English. Never, ever English. 2, and this has already come out, he was extremely well educated in the tradition of the classics. He started learning Greek and Latin in elementary school, and he went on to be fluent in French, German, Italian, Old English as well. Sir William Empson, who was one of the greatest literary critics of his generation, called Lewis the best-read man of his generation. Quote, "He had read everything and he remembered everything he read." So he was, I just think that's amazing that anybody would be called the best-read person of their generation. And I think he has fair claim to it. Third interesting thing, he never earned a PhD. So he was never Dr. Lewis. I have a PhD. So that is one way in which I am his superior. But probably the only way. Interestingly, Oxford and Cambridge did not award PhDs until relatively recently. These were considered a German invention and later picked up by American universities, beginning with Johns Hopkins. And most British scholars looked down their noses at PhDs. When I taught at the University of Leeds, some of my older colleagues from Oxford and Cambridge still just had a BA. But a BA Hons Oxon, BA Hons Cantab are considered just fine. One of them told me, in fact, that he considered PhDs a bit vulgar. It's like you're trying too hard. An Oxford BA ought to be enough. Fourth thing, one of his best friends was his fellow Oxford Don, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was a specialist in Old English philology and Norse mythology, and as I mentioned, he was a devout Roman Catholic believer, and they would go on these long walks. And Tolkien was a person who helped him come to Christian faith. Lewis, in turn, was a great admirer of Tolkien, and he championed Tolkien's written work and encouraged him to complete Lord of the Rings. It's generally accepted that Tolkien got into kind of a slump and he couldn't think of how to finish it. He'd lost his motivation. Lewis basically nagged him to keep going. Can it finish the book, finish the book, finish the book. Now send it to the publisher. And some people believe if Lewis had not encouraged him to do this, there would be no Hobbit, be no Lord of the Rings. So much so, Lewis even nominated Tolkien for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1961. He didn't get it, but that's how highly he thought. Though they were the best of friends, their relationship became a bit strained later in life for a couple of reasons. One was that Lewis's new friendship with Charles Williams had come between them. And another was that Tolkien actually disapproved of Lewis's marriage to Joy Davidman. In particular, he disapproved of the church wedding. His attitude was, well, yeah, okay, I can kind of see why you would have a chaste city hall or public registry marriage just so she can get her visa. But Tolkien was a conservative Roman Catholic. Joy Davidman's husband was still alive at this point. She was a divorced woman with a living husband, and this to him was theologically and morally unacceptable. And he thought you should not dignify that in a church wedding. And though they sort of made their peace, their relationship was never really the same. Fifth, and many of you will already know this, Lewis was a member of a group called the Inklings. This was a group of Christian writers who met in Oxford to discuss literature and theology and to share the books and papers they were working on. This group included both Lewis and Lewis's brother Warnie and J.R.R. Tolkien, and later Owen Barfield, Charles Williams, another writer called Hugo Dyson, and there were a few other hangers-on, but this was the main group over a number of years. And the plan was they would meet, every 2 weeks or every month in an Oxford pub, and then just listen to each other read samples of their work. It was at the Inklings that Tolkien read some of the first drafts of The Lord of the Rings. Apparently, he wasn't a very good reader of his own work. Some people can read aloud well, some people can't. Apparently, J.R.R. Tolkien did not read aloud well. And apparently he was they gave him a hard time about it, and finally he got his son to read his works aloud, and the son did much better. Sixth, Lewis was profoundly Christian. And so he has been admired and taken up by, celebrated by evangelicals, especially in the U.S., in recent decades. But I would argue Lewis was not really an evangelical in the normal sense of that term. Just a little digression. I grew up in an era when American evangelicalism was very rigidly legalistic and separatist. No smoking, no drinking, no dancing, no card playing. And there was a suspicion about education and high culture. None of that was true of Lewis. He was a heavy smoker of pipes and cigarettes, told that he smoked 60 a day on average. That's 3 packs, in addition to his pipe. He was a heavy drinker. He enjoyed his beer, enjoyed his scotch, enjoyed his wine, enjoyed his port. He was highly educated, had very sophisticated cultural tastes. He loved the classics, he loved the Norse sagas, he loved the poetry of Yeats, the music of Wagner, even as a teenager. So he just was not an American type evangelical. Apart from the years when he was an atheist, he was a lifelong Anglican, a member of first the Episcopal Church of Ireland, and then later the Church of England. His ecclesiastical instincts early on were decidedly low church, but gradually he migrated in a more high church direction. Let me just pause. Some of you will know these things, but maybe not all. Do you know what I'm talking about when I talk about low church versus high church? Do you know that? Okay, so low church is more, well, we are a low church in the sense that the theology is very evangelical. At church services, the preaching of the word is central. Don't go in for lots of liturgy or priests. You don't call your pastor a priest. I'm guessing Eric doesn't wear too many vestments. No, I have shorts tonight, so. Those are your vestments. And those are California vestments. So the high church, on the other hand, is sometimes called Anglo-Catholic. And so this is where Anglicans, they're still part of the same big church, but it's a very big tent. And so it feels more like a Catholic service. They will call the pastor the priest. I've heard some Anglo-Catholics refer to the Mass, but that's actually kind of unusual. But preaching the word is just one part of a normal Sunday service. Normally the Eucharist, the communion, Lord's Supper, is of equal importance and focus. Some of the really high churches go in for what they call smells and bells, with incense and then ringing of the bells at crucial points in the service. So Lewis started out as a low church Protestant and gradually migrated in the direction of high church Anglicanism. Just a funny story about his low church origins. Say he was raised in Northern Ireland. Belfast is the Protestant enclave, right? Northern Ireland is Northern Ireland now because that was Protestant majority when the Republic of Ireland split away and became an independent nation. The Republic of Ireland was overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. Northern Ireland, in particular Belfast, was a Protestant enclave. Now the Protestants in a majority Catholic country go to the other, they react so strongly that they go strongly low church to differentiate themselves from the Catholic majority. And you have never seen the kind of, over here, the sort of animosity that you will see over there between Catholic and Protestant. Lewis says that when he was a tiny boy, his Protestant nanny would take them out for walks. And when they would see puddles or, McGrath points out, piles of dog dung, she would say, "Be careful not to step in the wee Pope." So she was calling puddles, mud puddles, and dog dew, Pope. Now, another interesting fact, number 7, Lewis didn't get a chair, that is to say, a professorship. Oh, wait, one more thing I was going to say about Lewis not being an evangelical. A lot of the leading British evangelicals of the day, such as Martin Lloyd-Jones, distrusted Lewis. They actually didn't want much to do with him because he was quite broadly ecumenical in his outlook, and he had non-standard views about the Bible, about the nature of inspiration. He didn't believe in inerrancy. That was a doctrine that was cooked up by American evangelicals about 40 years later. He trusted the Bible. He regarded it as authoritative, but was he an inerrantist? Probably not. He had unusual views about the atonement. In the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he doesn't have a substitutionary atonement. He has a ransom theory of atonement, which is very non-standard. And in his book, The Great Divorce, he actually flirts with the idea of universalism. Now, he doesn't assert it, but he sort of poses it as a possibility. Now, for all these reasons, the leading British evangelicals of the day did not consider him one of them. Now, later they came around to admire him, but they kept him at arm's length. So back to my script here. 7th point. He did not get a professorship until late in life. He did not get a chair until late in life. Now you might think that anybody who's a graduate of Oxford or Cambridge and has the BA Hons next to their name goes automatically to the top of the heap. But that is not necessarily so. It is, of course, an honor to be made a fellow of an Oxford college, as he was. But within the university, as a whole, people try to work their way through the ranks, from junior lecturer to lecturer, from lecturer to senior lecturer, to reader, and then to professor. And if you're professor, you get a chair. That's what it is to be a professor. You have a chair. It doesn't mean you're the administrative chairman of the department, but it's like having an endowed chair. I was a senior lecturer in my old university. That's as high as most academics get. If you're ambitious and you have lots of outstanding scholarly publications in your belt, you might apply for a readership or apply for a professorship, a chair. It was actually a source of some irritation. Tolkien was made a professor in 1926. Lewis labored on for decades without a chair. He badly wanted a chair in Oxford, and he applied, and he was nominated several times, but he was almost always the runner-up. University politics often affected these things, and while Lewis had many admirers, he also had some critics. Some of his critics didn't like the fact that he was so openly religious. They just didn't get that at all. Or they didn't like the particular brand of Christianity that he represented. Or they resented his popularity. I can tell you in academia still, being popular is, that's something that lots of academics disdain or pretend to disdain. And they also thought he had published too much lightweight stuff. Anyway, when he eventually did get a chair, it was in Oxford's arch rival institution, Cambridge University. Now, you might think, well, Oxford, Cambridge, it's the same thing, right? Not at all. We do talk about Oxbridge, putting these together kind of as a portmanteau word, but they're totally different institutions, miles apart, completely different histories. They're considered rivals. They're still rivals. As you may know, people from Oxford will jokingly even refrain from saying the name of Cambridge. They just will refer to it as the other place. And people from Cambridge do the same. In case this still hasn't clicked for you, let me put it in these terms. Imagine somebody who wants to be head coach at UCLA, and they work their way up in football, but they never get the position of head coach. Other people keep getting promoted to head coach over them. But then they are offered a head coach position at USC. Okay, now multiply that by 10, and that's what it's like for Lewis. He had wanted his whole career to have an Oxford professorship, and he never got it. But he did get it by going to the rival institution. Now, finally, Lewis, and I don't think I'm telling any secrets here, Lewis was a morally flawed human being, like the rest of us. He was a mixed bag. He had professional enemies, as well as his friends and admirers, in and around Oxford. He could be ferocious in argumentation, and there are people who write in their memoirs that Lewis came across as kind of an intellectual bully. He also had a puzzling, and I will put it euphemistically, non-standard relationship with an older woman, Mrs. Moore. She was the mother of his Oxford friend, Paddy Moore, and both Lewis and Paddy were, before they were going off to fight in the First World War, they made a promise with each other. The promise was if one of them survived and the other one didn't, the one who survived would look after the other one's parent, because Lewis had a widower father and Paddy Moore had a widow mother. So they made this promise, solemn promise. Paddy Moore did not survive. Lewis took his promise very seriously, and he looked after Mrs. Moore. They lived together for many years, and it's not just circumstantial evidence. There's actually quite a lot of evidence that the relationship became more than just renter. You know, there's quite a lot of debate among the various autobiographers and people who knew Lewis. Some people say, oh, it's absolutely true. Not absolutely false. McGrath, who has got the best autobiography, he says, well, there's actually pretty decent evidence that there was, well, that it was a non-standard relationship. I think one can sometimes detect a whiff of misogyny, or at the very least, very, very old-fashioned views about gender roles and relations between the sexes in his work. Just one little minor example. Dorothy Sayers, some of you will know Dorothy Sayers, right? Author of the Peter Wimsey books. Important writer in her own right. She wanted to be part of the Inklings, right? Christian intellectual writer, studied at Oxford. I write this stuff. People buy my books. Can I not join your club? And apparently it was Lewis who didn't want girls in the club. So about all that stuff, in his life. I don't think we should pretend it's not there. But I also think we should not let it spoil our appreciation of the lots and lots of very good stuff that is there. And remember, he was a creature of his time and place. Right? He's a Victorian, for starters. His mother died when he was 9 years old. That had a profound impact on his emotional development. He was a bachelor don in a thoroughly male-dominated institution for most of his life. And I think that accounts for a lot of his old-fashioned views about women and whether they belonged in the university and whether they belonged in, whether they could be the intellectual equals of men and so forth. I'm inclined to think that given all of that and the fact that he was writing, 80 years ago, I think it's amazing that his attitudes about women were as good as they were. And anyway, Lewis would be the last person who would want anyone to think that he was a perfect plaster saint. Let me... One more point. When you're reading his stuff, don't be put off by the 1940s British English. There will be terms, there will be references, there will be allusions, forms of language that are unfamiliar. Just look them up in a dictionary. That really will help. I think the cultural distance was not as great when I started reading his books over 50 years ago, but time has passed and some of this is unfamiliar, especially the younger generation. So if you see something in his books you don't read, just look it up. Now, that's all I've got. There are other things I can say, but I think this is probably a good time to wrap up the formal part of the presentation. So questions or comments? Yeah, this lady.
Is Lewis an Irish name?
Lewis is not an Irish name, interestingly. Though his father was born and raised in Ireland, according to Lewis's own personal genealogy, Lewis's grandfather or great-grandfather emigrated from Wales. Lewis is normally a Welsh name. So he has at least a drop of Welsh in him. But again, that's Celtic blood. So the Welsh and the Irish and the Scots are all Celts, and they're all on the same side against the English. This lady here.
Did he have a photographic memory?
You will hear people say that, and this guy Empson says he read everything and he remembered everything that he read. I think it was very nearly photographic. Now, I should hasten to add, I never met Lewis. I have met people who have met Lewis. I've met people who knew him. And they did seem to say that he could pull quotations out of the air, classical quotations, whether it was in Greek or Latin or Old English, from poetry or prose or drama. He could just, or the Book of Common Prayer, he could pull them out of the air almost on command. Do any of you know Walter Hansen? Eric, you were saying Walter Hansen had some connection with...
Gene Johnson's brother from our church is Walter Hansen.
Okay, so this is a digression, but it gets at your point. So Walter Hansen was a New Testament scholar who was for many years a trustee over at Westmont. During our relationship, we came to realize that we both really liked and admired Lewis a lot. Walter had me read a draft of a paper that he eventually published. It's on C.S. Lewis and Augustine on friendship. They both have really interesting things to say about friendship. So there's stuff particularly in Augustine's Confessions where he talks about friendship, the death of one of his friends that had a big impact on him. And Lewis has stuff to say about friendship in his book, The Four Loves, because in fact, friendship is one of the four different kinds of love that there are. Now, Walter, who's a great admirer of Lewis, writes a paper criticizing Lewis's account of friendship, or the stuff that he wrote about friendship, and in particular his, how Lewis related to Augustine. And Walter points out that Lewis actually makes a couple of mistakes in his account of friendship. For instance, he says that the friend of Augustine's who died was Nebridius. He said, "What?" And Walter actually goes back and looks in the confession and said, "No, it's not. It's a different guy." Now, the reason I mention this is Lewis's memory was so good that he didn't feel the need to check the originals. Most of it was in his head, and most of it was, it was sort of 90% accurate. His memory was that good. But occasionally there's the lapse that I think is explained by the fact that he didn't go back. He was just trusting the memory. I can give you the reference for the very interesting article by Walter if you want. This man here had a comment.
Do you know, is C.S. Lewis interested in like modern theology of his time? Like, big giants like Karl Barth, anybody like that?
He did interact with modern theology to a certain extent. His opinion about it, as far as I can make out, was very mixed. And I think mostly he didn't like it. He's a traditionalist. He's a romantic. And I don't mean romantic just in the emotional sense, but romanticism as a reaction against modernism. And the romantic wants to champion old things, nostalgia, tradition, the Middle Ages, instead of, the 19th and 20th centuries. And he had much more time for Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Boethius than 20th century theologians. Now, Karl Barth was one that he seemed to respect. And I've seen quotations that about Barth's general approach, Lewis is supposed to have said in conversation, that seems to me about right. There are some American theologians that he says some very rude things about. He says some very rude things about one of the Niebers, for example. So 20th century theology that's trying to be trendy and relevant, he just doesn't have much time for. The kind of Harvey Cox, Secular City, I think would probably make him sick. Yes, this man.
His relationship with G.K. Chesterton.
He was a great admirer of Chesterton. I can't now remember so G.K. Chesterton, a prominent English journalist, late 19th, early 20th century, they would have overlapped. I don't know whether they ever met, but Lewis is clear that Chesterton was, along with George MacDonald, one of the people who sort of baptized his imagination and helped him, and by imagination he means something quite special, which is a kind of an ability to see and sense the world and to sense the meaning in the world. Chesterton was one of the people who helped baptize his imagination. So he really admires. I've never worked out whether they have met. Chesterton was certainly from an earlier generation. Yeah.
Why do you count Screwtape Letters as one of his favorite works? Your favorite?
Oh, one of mine? Well, first, it's really funny. I mean, it's pretty wry sometimes, but there's laugh out loud funny stuff in there. And the same is true of The Great Divorce. But it's not just funny. I think it's really spiritually perceptive. Both of those books, I think, are ultimately about the relationship between virtue and character and the way that these can be formed with God's help and grace, or lost under demonic temptation. And ultimately, whether they are formed and retained or lost, well, as G.K. Chesterton says at one point, sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. And that motif is working its way through Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce. And so I think it's wonderful.
If Lewis was alive today, where would he fit in?
Boy, that's really interesting. I should also mention, I'm just going to deviate for a second. I told you that I said Screwtape Letters I think is just very funny. Great Divorce is very funny. If you haven't read Great Divorce, please do it. Read it on the plane. You can read it on the, well, you'll be reading Surprised by Joy, so maybe you don't have time. But, okay, all right. So I'm not giving much away. The Great Divorce is an exploration of the ideas of heaven, purgatory, or hell, purgatory, and heaven. It begins with a gray town. And a guy finds himself in this gray, miserable town. And he gets in line for a bus, gets on the bus just because he's got no better place to be. It turns out the bus takes off and flies straight into the air. And it's a fantasy story. And it lands in a bright, beautiful land where everything is completely solid. Everything is much more solid than in this gray, ghostly town where he had been. Now, we eventually start to work out, okay, so this place is heaven. That other place was sort of hell, question mark, purgatory, question mark. And the ghosts are offered the option to stay, but they have to give up every bit of sin. They have to give up everything that's holy. They have to unholy. They have to give up everything that they want more than God. So if there's anything that you love more than you love God, you have to give it up. And if you do that, you can stay. Now, almost all the ghosts refuse to do that. They've all got some reason they need to go back to the gray city. One of them, we learn, is an Anglican bishop who's needs to go back because he's got a theological discussion society, and he's working on a paper that he's going to be presenting next week. And the paper is about, it's a shame that Jesus died as such a young man, because it would have been interesting to know, if he'd lived a little longer, how his views might have matured. And, again, I think it's terribly funny, but that's also really a kind of devastating theological put-down. Now, so you're asking me, if Lewis had lived a little longer, where would he have come out? I think he would have remained a loyal Anglican to the end of his life. I think he would have tried, I said he had these high church tendencies, but in Mere Christianity, he is so emphatic. He is not going to push any particular brand of Christian faith. And that's what he means by mere Christianity. He just wants to, it's the kind of common core to the Christian faith. You know, the thing that any Christian, every Christian, all Christians ought to believe. That's all he says, I got my views about this non-core stuff, but he said, that's not my point here. Another sort of analogy, he says, my goal is to get you into the building, into the hall. Now, you'll have to go into one of the rooms off the hall for your spiritual life, your Christian life, your church life, your fellowship. You can't stay in the hall forever. You're going to have to end up in a denomination or a congregation. But he says, that's not my job. My job is to get you into the hall. And so, yeah, I'm not sure where we would have ended up, but I think he would just say, in a way, it doesn't matter, as long as you and I and everyone we're in fellowship with are embracing mere Christianity. I don't think he would have owned a cell phone. Well, maybe that's enough for tonight. Again, I really, I think you guys are going to have a blast. And not just because of the stuff connected with C.S. Lewis. Eric tells me that you'll be flying into Edinburgh, which is a beautiful city. I think it may be my favorite city in the British Isles. It's just gorgeous, and unlike London, it's of manageable size. You can wrap your arms around Edinburgh. You can't really do that with London any more than you can do it with New York. So, but anyway, you'll have a great trip.
Yes, thank you very much for being here this evening and sharing your thoughts and insights. Something else? Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Let's see, couple things. If you are here and you're thinking, I want to go on the trip now that I heard all this, it's too late. Sorry. I checked for somebody the other day and it's too late. But more seriously, next week we'll be back, and we are also going to have a professor from Westmont. Alistair Chapman will be with us, and he is going to address kind of more fully the contemporary scene of kind of modern Anglicanism and the state of the church in the UK. He's going to bring us up to speed on some of those things next week, so he will be here. And then the following week will be our last week, and I will be talking a little bit more about some of the Christianity in Scotland, a little bit more about the Reformation, and hopefully we'll touch on Ireland. But then we'll talk about some of the other more modern characters that are important to the story as well. So again, thank you to Dr. Nelson for being here tonight. And if you have any other questions for him, catch him before he takes off. But thanks so much for being here tonight. We'll see you. Yeah, go ahead. I don't believe so. I think we're wrapped up. Yeah.